Behind Illinois' prison walls, a silent war is being fought, a war carved into tattoos, whispered through steel bars and paid for in blood. This is where gangs don't just survive, they govern. Hidden alliances, secret economies, brutal betrayals, and a power structure more complex than anything on the streets. What you're about to hear is real, documented in court files, investigative reports, and years of suppressed testimony. Before we dive deeper, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Trust me, you won't want to miss the next chapter of this true, unfiltered story. Illinois prisons have always been dangerous, but the modern era of gang warfare behind the bars didn't explode overnight. It simmered, evolved, and then detonated with a force that reshaped the entire correctional landscape. Long before smartphones, social media, or organized task forces, the cells of Stateville, Pontiac, and Menard were already operating with an internal hierarchy the public barely understood. To outsiders, prison looks like chaos. To insiders, it's a government of factions, each with its own courts, codes, soldiers, and taxes. Gangs weren't just gangs. They were institutions. The gangster disciples, the vice lords, the Black P. Stones, the Latin Kings, and several white supremacist crews didn't simply exist inside Illinois Department of Corrections (IDOC). They ran it. And the deeper investigators dug, the more they realized. The rules inside the walls weren't written by wardens, they were written by shot callers. In the mid-1980s through the 1990s, Illinois prisons became something like a closed-off Cold War. Every block was a territory. Every yard movement was a negotiation. Mess halls turned into diplomatic zones where violence could erupt over a single wrong glance. Even new inmates entering the system could feel the tension humming in the air. You didn't walk into prison, you walked into a chessboard. One Stateville guard famously described it like this: "We control the keys, but the gangs control everything else." That wasn't exaggeration. That was confession. Inside these walls, gang affiliation wasn't a choice. It was survival. Men who had never joined anything on the streets were pressured, gently at first, then with fists, razors, or boiling oil. Prison gangs in Illinois didn't just recruit, they absorbed. But this wasn't just brutality. It was strategy. Over the decades, law enforcement watched gang politics morph into full-blown governance. The gangster disciples had written constitutions, ranking structures, revenue channels, and enforcement squads. Court filings from federal cases later revealed a military-like chain of command that extended from Chicago's South Side into cell blocks almost 200 miles away. Meanwhile, the Latin Kings were building their own parallel society. Their leader, known by many inmates simply as the Crown, communicated orders from behind bars that influenced both street-level decisions and internal prison discipline. If a fight broke out in a Chicago neighborhood, there was a good chance it originated with a decision made in a cell no bigger than a bathroom. And then there were the alliances. Illinois prisons became home to shifting coalitions. Blacks versus Latinos one month, then. Black gangs uniting against a rising white power bloc the next, then. Latino groups forming temporary ceasefires to take over a unit. Every move had intention. Every truce had a price. Even corrections officers learned to recognize the patterns. A quiet unit didn't mean safety, it often meant planning. A loud one might mean instability, or someone testing boundaries. And when word started spreading that a green light had been issued on an inmate, everyone felt it, sometimes before the target even knew. Perhaps the most shocking truth was this: the violence behind the bars wasn't random. It was organized, calculated, proved. Knife jobs were assigned like business tasks. Extortion was tracked like tax income. Smuggling operations used lines of communication that stretched across counties. Drugs moved through kitchens, laundry rooms, visiting booths, and corrupt staff. Phones were more valuable than freedom. But at the center of everything was power: who held it, who wanted it, and who was willing to bleed for it. By the early 2000s, Illinois officials quietly admitted that they were not in control in certain facilities. Not fully. Some wardens tried locking down entire prisons for months at a time. Some split up gang leaders and shipped them downstate. Others embraced segregation units to disrupt the networks. But the gangs adapted faster than IDOC could react. Because this wasn't just crime. This was culture. A culture that had been forged through riots, solitary confinement, racial clashes, and decades of distrust. A culture that would soon erupt into some of the most violent episodes in Illinois prison history. And it all began with one core truth. Inside Illinois prisons, the bars might separate bodies, but they don't separate power. By the late 1990s, tension inside Illinois prisons wasn't just rising, it was pressurized. Every inmate felt it. Every officer sensed it. And every gang leader understood that one wrong move, one sloppy decision, could spark a chain reaction that would reshape the state's entire correctional system. Violence wasn't new to Illinois prisons. Stateville and Pontiac had reputations carved in stone. But the late 90s and early 2000s earned a darker title among investigators: the Blood Years. This wasn't about one incident. It was a sequence, a collision of old loyalties, new ambitions, overcrowding, and a correctional staff stretched to the breaking point. The fuse truly lit in Pontiac Correctional Center. Pontiac had always been a pressure cooker, a high-security labyrinth where the state sent the most volatile, most influential, and most unpredictable inmates. For years, a fragile balance existed between the major gangs. Everyone operated by a kind of unspoken treaty. Stay in your lane, keep your word, respect the pecking order. It wasn't peace, it was controlled warfare. But around 1997 to 1998, that balance shifted. The younger generation of gang members entering the system didn't follow the old rules. They weren't raised under the same codes. They weren't loyal to the big homies. They came in hot, angry, impulsive, and ready to prove themselves. For the older shot callers, this was a nightmare. Nothing destabilizes prison power like soldiers who don't listen. Investigators later noted a disturbing trend. The younger guys were treating prison like a stage. A place to build their reputation. A place to be seen. Disrespect multiplied. Minor disputes blew up. And rival crews began testing each other with little stabbings and ambushes. Not for dominance, but for sport. But the real turning point came when a group of gangster disciples and vice lords got into a violent confrontation over control of the prison's illicit store system. A black market economy centered on food, hygiene items, gambling debts, and contraband distribution. This store was worth thousands per month, even behind bars. Whoever ran it ran the unit. Inside Pontiac, that meant everything. A fistfight in the day room spiraled into a coordinated retaliation that shook the entire institution. 8 inmates were stabbed in under 2 hours. Officers later reported finding handmade shanks hidden in ventilation grates, toilet tanks, and even inside light fixtures, each weapon crafted with precision, each strike clearly ordered by higher-ups. But the gangs didn't stop at violence. They began weaponizing communication. Investigators found coded letters traveling between Stateville, Menard, and Pontiac. Messages disguised as poetry, religious reflections, or legal paperwork. A single line like "the sun sets earlier than it used to" might be a kill order. A reference to "the brothers in the garden waiting for rain" could signal an upcoming attack. It wasn't cryptic by accident, it was efficient. This growing intelligence network terrified IDOC leadership. Because every time prison officials moved a gang leader, broke up a cell house, or tried isolating troublemakers, the gangs adapted. They'd simply shift operations to another facility or appoint new leaders who already had instructions waiting. And then came the incident that forced the state to admit publicly that something was very wrong. At Stateville Correctional Center, a fight broke out during yard time between members of 2 rival factions. A dispute so personal, so petty, that staff originally assumed it would end quickly. But it didn't. Instead, it escalated into a full-scale eruption involving over 100 inmates across multiple yards. Officers later described the scene as a battlefield from the moment the sirens hit. Men running with weapons. Others dragging injured comrades behind benches. Some acting as lookouts. Some sprinting straight into the fight, eager to make a name. The attack left multiple inmates hospitalized and marked one of the most violent days in Illinois prison history, according to court filings and after-action reports. It was no longer possible to pretend this was random. It was structure. It was war. And it was spilling into the open. But the scariest part wasn't the violence itself. It was the realization that different facilities were experiencing parallel outbreaks, at the exact same time. Almost coordinated. The gang networks were becoming statewide. By the early 2000s, the Illinois Department of Corrections quietly reached a conclusion it didn't want the public to hear. They were dealing with an insurgency, not just inmates. The gangs had evolved into something far more potent than loose groups of criminals. They were power blocks. They controlled the flow of contraband. They influenced entire units. They shaped inmate culture. And they had communication lines that outpaced official channels. The war behind the bars was no longer a series of fights. It was a system. A parallel government built on fear, hierarchy, and absolute obedience. And this was only the beginning. Because soon, a series of incidents would expose how deeply embedded these gangs really were, not only in the yards and cell blocks, but in the daily operations of the prisons themselves. By the time Illinois officials fully grasped how organized the prison gangs had become, another problem had already taken root, one far more difficult to contain. The gangs weren't just fighting each other. They weren't just running underground economies. They weren't just communicating between facilities. They were infiltrating the system itself. Every prison in the United States has some degree of staff corruption. That's no secret. But Illinois in the late 90s and early 2000s became a case study for how deeply criminal networks can worm their way into the very institution meant to hold them. This wasn't cartoon-level corruption. This was structural infiltration. Some staff didn't enter the job intending to help gangs. Many were simply overworked, underpaid, exhausted, and dealing with a dangerous work environment where they were outnumbered at all times. Others had personal vulnerabilities, debt, addiction, fear, or even misguided compassion. And the gangs knew exactly how to exploit all of it. Inside Stateville, Pontiac, Menard, and even medium-security facilities like Hill and Shawnee, investigations later revealed that gangs used a blend of intimidation and incentives to get what they wanted. For some officers, the pitch was subtle. A few $100s for bringing in cigarettes. A little more for a cell phone. Double for drugs. Triple for information. For others, the pitch wasn't a pitch, it was a threat. Word would accidentally get back to them that someone knew where their kids went to school, what car they drove, or where their spouse worked. There were limits to what gangs could do from behind bars, but fear travels far. A smuggling pipeline slowly formed. Phones. SIM cards. USB drives. K2. Crystal meth. Heroin. Even small tactical knives disguised as everyday items. Things inmates weren't supposed to have, but often had in abundance. One internal audit later concluded that during certain months, Illinois inmates had more functioning cell phones than correctional staff. More than once, gang members behind bars coordinated street-level crimes using illegally smuggled phones, shootings, drug drops, extortion networks, even retaliation hits. Court filings repeatedly documented how prison leaders were directing street soldiers in real time. The old joke became painfully real. You go to prison to get away from them, and they still call you from inside. One of the most shocking investigations unfolded at Menard Correctional Center, where a handful of officers were discovered to have been collaborating with gang leaders for years. These officers weren't just smuggling contraband, they were feeding intel, tipping off leaders about upcoming searches, and even helping orchestrate separations between rival inmates to prevent disturbances that might interfere with certain gangs' operations. In some cases, officers developed emotional attachments to inmates, something experts call undue familiarity. A few of these relationships turned into romantic entanglements. A few turned into business arrangements. A few turned into loyalty shifts that no longer aligned with the uniform. But corruption didn't stop at smuggling. It seeped into the very administrative structure. Some gang leaders learned to exploit grievance systems, legal loopholes, and procedural delays. Others used family members on the outside to funnel bribes and payments to willing staff. Court records from multiple federal cases show that outside associates would hand off envelopes of cash, often through intermediaries, to employees who pretended it was side money or consulting fees. And then came the most dangerous part: information trafficking. Knowing which inmate was being moved, which unit was under investigation, which officer was vulnerable, what the schedule was, or when a shakedown was coming, that was worth more than drugs or phones combined. A single piece of intel could prevent a stabbing or greenlight one. At Pontiac, an internal review uncovered that a corrections employee had leaked the names of informants to a white supremacist crew. Those names quickly circulated within the prison. 2 men were stabbed. Both survived, barely. In Stateville, a separate inquiry found that gang leaders had created their own intelligence database based entirely on leaked staff information. It included cell assignments, disciplinary patterns, guard rotations, and even personal histories of newer officers. Imagine the strategic advantage that gave them. By the mid-2000s, it became clear that the gangs didn't just operate within the cracks of the system, they were thriving in them. Illinois prison officials launched aggressive anti-corruption campaigns. Background checks. Surprise shakedowns. Sting operations. Staff monitoring. Technology sweeps. Internal audits. Undercover investigations. Some officers were arrested. Others resigned. A few faced long prison sentences of their own. But each time the state patched a hole, another opened. Because corruption wasn't the disease, it was the symptom. The real disease was the strength of the gang networks themselves. For every staff member caught, 2 more had been approached. For every contraband phone confiscated, 3 more were already in circulation. For every corrupt officer exposed, 5 more were under pressure, financially or physically, without anyone knowing. The deeper investigators looked, the more horrifying the picture became. The gangs weren't just surviving inside Illinois prisons. They were influencing the architecture of the institution itself. But what came next would expose an even darker layer, a chapter where alliances shifted, betrayals multiplied, and a new kind of warfare emerged. A warfare not driven by brute strength, but by information. If the blood years were defined by physical violence, the next era inside Illinois prisons shifted toward a far more dangerous kind of warfare. One fought with whispers, coded messages, and invisible allegiances. This was the period investigators later described as the intelligence war. For decades, gangs inside Illinois facilities relied on muscle to maintain order. Stabbings, jump-ins, ambushes and blind spots. But as correctional leadership cracked down and technology changed the landscape, gang leaders began adopting new tactics. They evolved. Instead of fighting each other in the open, they began fighting for information. By the early 2000s, prison gangs realized something powerful. Controlling knowledge was more effective than controlling bodies. Every call, every move, every whispered rumor, every cell transfer, every staff shift change, every disciplinary write-up, every classified memo that slipped through the cracks. Information turned into currency, more valuable than drugs, more valuable than contraband, sometimes even more valuable than a weapon. Investigators would later testify that some of Illinois' most violent gangs operated with intelligence units of their own, inmates whose job was to gather and interpret information. These men didn't always fit the stereotype. Some were older, respected, educated. Others were young, observant, and invisible enough to slip between factions without drawing attention. They tracked everything. Who owed money? Who was cooperating with staff? Who had enemies? Who was falling out of favor with their own gang? Who was getting ready to parole? Which officer was vulnerable? Which unit was understaffed? Which inmate was secretly seeking protection? And most importantly, who had cracked under pressure? The intelligence war didn't start with violence. It started with suspicion. At Stateville, an intercepted letter revealed multiple gangs were sharing intel with one another, not because they were allies but because each wanted leverage over the others. This was new. The old generations never trusted across gang lines. But the new ones understood. An informant in the wrong place was more deadly than a rival with a shank. By 2004, an entire underground marketplace formed. A pipeline where inmates traded names of snitches, movement schedules, upcoming searches, and even staff weaknesses. Some of it was accurate. Some of it was pure manipulation designed to weaponize paranoia. Pontiac Correctional Center became the epicenter. One senior investigator called it psychological warfare with blood on the back end. Because the moment someone was labeled hot, meaning suspected of cooperation, that label often became a death sentence long before truth could catch up. Fake intel became a tool of assassination. If a gang wanted someone gone, they didn't need to attack him outright. All they had to do was spread quietly, strategically, that he was talking to internal affairs. Within days, a hit team would handle the rest, and the gang issuing the lie never got blamed. That was the brilliance and the horror of the intelligence war. Some gangs began using ghost messages, small notes written on dissolvable paper hidden inside food trays, books, or commissary bags. A single word could change everything. Even more disturbing, Illinois Department of Corrections investigators discovered inmates using legal mail, protected by law from search, to send coded intel between facilities. A paragraph about case evidence might really be a message about a rival's location. A reference to insufficient discovery might translate to attack delayed. Copies of court motions were used to mask kill orders. And then the biggest breakthrough happened, not through violence but through data. In 2005, an undercover operation revealed that certain gang leaders were pooling resources to hire outside associates who had access to public records databases. Why? Because Illinois law made some inmate information publicly searchable. With just a name and a facility, outside associates could pull court records, indictment details, police reports, cooperation notes, sentencing transcripts, prosecutor statements. And inside the prison world, knowing a man had ever testified, even once, was enough to destroy him. Correctional staff were stunned. The gangs had basically outsourced intelligence analysis to the free world. Some leaders even kept printed dossiers hidden inside their cells, neatly organized intelligence files detailing dozens of inmates. These weren't scribbles. They looked like miniature case files. One federal prosecutor later said, "They were running a counterintelligence operation. In prison. With better organization than some small police departments. But with all this information flying around, trust inside the gangs crumbled. Old alliances fractured. Shot callers began questioning their own lieutenants. Veteran members feared being falsely labeled as snitches by ambitious young rivals. Paranoia became the real warden." By 2006, Illinois prisons saw a sharp rise in preemptive strikes, attacks committed not out of certainty but out of suspicion. Men were stabbed in showers, yards, and hallways simply because someone heard they might be talking, or might be unstable. No evidence needed. Rumor was enough. Internal affairs struggled to keep up. The more they intervened, the more the gangs adapted. The more they adapted, the more sophisticated their networks became. One thing became painfully clear. The intelligence war wasn't a phase. It was the new normal. And behind every coded message, every staged act of violence, every suspicious transfer, something even darker was brewing. A structural shift that would change how Illinois ran its prisons, forever. By the late 2000s, Illinois prisons had entered a new, terrifying phase, one defined not by isolated incidents or sudden explosions of violence, but by a slow, suffocating pressure that wrapped itself around every tier, every gallery, every yard gate. This era became known, unofficially, quietly but universally, as lockdown state. Because when you're losing control of your own system, the only move left is to shut it down. Illinois Department of Corrections wasn't blind to the intelligence war spreading through their facilities. The coded memos, the shifting alliances, the psychological warfare, it all made the prison environment unpredictable in a way that traditional security protocols weren't built for. In the past, violence had rhythm. Racial tension spikes in summer, gang retaliation cycles, holiday agitation. But now, there was no rhythm. No pattern. No season. Everything felt like it could ignite at any moment. The wardens had a choice. Clamp down or lose control. And they clamped down. At Pontiac, entire units were ordered into months-long lockdowns. Doors stayed closed. Yard time vanished. Visits were limited. Showers were rationed. Commissary slowed to a drip. Inmates ate meals pushed through the chuck hole, day after day, month after month. For a system already stretched thin, it was the only viable solution. But for the inmates? It was gasoline on a fire. Locked inside 23 hours a day, sometimes 24, tensions sharpened like razor metal. Men who once navigated rivalries through structured routines, yard, chow hall, job assignments, now stewed in darkness with nothing but their fears and grudges. You can cage bodies, but you can't cage thoughts. And in isolation, the gang networks grew even more strategic. Stateville became a fortress under siege. Yard movements were slashed. Work programs cut. Even legal visits saw increased scrutiny. Officers stood on edge. Every door opening felt like a risk. Every shift felt heavier than the last. A veteran guard later said in a public hearing, "The tension wasn't loud. It was quiet. Too quiet. That's when you know something's wrong." The intelligence war had driven the gangs underground. Lockdown state forced them deeper still. But something unexpected happened. The more restricted the prison became, the more efficiently the gangs operated. Because when you cut off all the noise, the whispers grow clearer. Inmates with influence began running operations with surgical precision. With everyone confined, gang leaders could map out the entire population like a strategist planning a military campaign. They knew which cells held which members, who had debts, who was slipping, who was angry, who was scared. Pressure intensified everything. Rumors about informants became lethal. Old grudges resurfaced. New rivalries formed. Paranoia climbed like ivy up every cell wall. And then came the breaking points, moments where the tension inside a lockdown environment became too much to contain. One of the most infamous occurred at Menard. During a heavily restricted period, a gang lieutenant managed to coordinate simultaneous attacks on 2 inmates in separate tiers. These strikes weren't spontaneous. They were planned and timed to test how long it would take staff to respond during lockdown conditions. Investigators were horrified. This wasn't violence born from chaos. It was a field test. If the gangs could time response delays, they could time assassinations. That revelation forced IDOC to deploy emergency response teams more frequently. Black-clad tactical units stormed cell houses with shields, gas, and restraints, searching for weapons, contraband, coded notes, anything. But the gangs expected the raids. At Stateville, officers raided a cell belonging to a high-ranking GD member, only to find the cell spotlessly clean. No phone. No notes. No contraband. No shanks. But weeks later, investigators learned that the same inmate had been running communications through another prisoner 3 cells down, using a reflection off a polished metal tray to pass visual signals during meal distribution. That level of creativity terrified officials. Lockdown wasn't breaking the gangs. It was refining them. Pontiac saw a similar escalation when a white supremacist faction staged a hunger strike disguised as a protest over commissary prices. But internal affairs later uncovered the truth: it was a smokescreen. The real motive was to flood the infirmary with members so they could pass messages between housing units under medical supervision. Even punishment became opportunity. Officials realized too late that isolation units, meant to control violence, became intelligence hubs. Leaders in segregation had fewer distractions and more time to strategize. Some ran entire operations from the hole, issuing commands through kites, legal mail, or coded phone calls through other inmates. But it all came to a head when Illinois attempted its boldest move yet: mass transfers. The plan was simple in theory: break up the power bases, scatter the leaders, shatter the networks. But in practice, it created chaos. Buses shuffled high-ranking members around the state: Stateville to Pontiac, Pontiac to Menard, Menard to Lawrence, Lawrence back to Stateville. But every move triggered new conflicts. Neutral yards became battlegrounds. Non-affiliated inmates got caught in the crossfire. Housing units turned into unfamiliar war zones. And worst of all, the gangs anticipated it. Leadership chains adapted instantly. New shot callers stepped up. Communication shifted. Violence flared where no violence was expected. The Illinois Department of Corrections was learning a painful lesson. You can lock down a prison, but you can't lock down a movement. And behind every locked door, every slammed gate, every muffled scream in a darkened tier, something bigger was forming. A collision of gang culture, failed policy, and human pressure that would soon spiral into some of the deadliest events in Illinois prison history. As the dust settles across Illinois' most volatile prisons, one truth becomes impossible to ignore: the war behind the bars never really ends. It shifts, it adapts, it waits. Every lockdown, every coded message, every sudden whisper of violence is just another chapter in a story that's still unfolding today. What you've seen is only a fraction of the hidden machinery that runs beneath the cell blocks. A world shaped by power, fear, ruthless loyalty, and the kind of alliances most people will never hear about. If you found this deep dive eye-opening, there's more coming. More stories, more investigations, more truth pulled straight from court records, public documents, and real-world testimonies. Before you go, hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and drop a comment below. Your support helps expose the realities buried behind concrete walls and steel bars. Thanks for watching. Stay safe, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next episode.